Welcome to the world of sci-fi stories, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the channel. Enjoy the listening. Humans can make friends with anything. In the last days of the Grand War of Reptiles, the intergalactic congression, with the aid of the humans of Terra Prime and Anger of Ugara, made leaps and bounds in the struggle against the Kuzur lizard men. Nearly all of the lizard planetary posts had been destroyed or overtaken one after the other, with victory on the horizon. Just when it seemed like total victory was assured, a piece of terrible news rang in the ears of the High Council, and immediate action was taken. A small militia was formed within days and sent off to the uninhabited world of Gra, a planet with no intelligent life, nearly twice the size of Terra Prime's moon, and covered in thick deciduous forests and long stretches of mountains with streams and lakes wrapping around its equator, a seemingly uninteresting planet worth no notice except for the Kuzur lizard men who had made a small outpost there for some reason, perhaps a final stand against all odds, a last-ditch foothold, who knows. But when the reason was discovered, a code red was initiated. General Tuxi, a species of Xeno that Terran describers looking like their stereotypical description of aliens, took the lead, being coaled by the Hierophant Flix, accompanied by 5 members of the Terrasowala species, a group of Xenos resembling turtles, and 3 humans from Terra Prime. Once they made landfall at Gra, the small militia made a small camp to serve the planet and locate the Kuzur lizard men. The 3 humans, 3 fraternal triples known as Jack, Jock, and Jake, set out on their own to do their service and scope the planet in the hope of finding anything on the lizards. While Tuxi wouldn't normally allow anyone to go out alone, the Terran were from a Class 15 death world, and Gra was a Class 8. This would be easy for them. And besides, Terran always made progress on whatever they did the day they set off. Things were good, but when the mandatory update was required, they didn't call in. It was quickly found that something in Gra's atmosphere made radio contact impossible. General Tuxi could only hope that the turn would see this and return within the day, but they never did. The day turned to night, and soon the days passed without the Terran making any return. General Tuxi could only assume that they had perished, whether to the local 4 or the lizards, but a medical event happened when all 3 Terran returned one odd day, about a week after their apparent disappearance. While everyone was glad they weren't dead, Tuxi was thrilled and immediately grilled the 3 brothers. Where in the name of the 7th moon have you 3 been? I would have thought the 3 of you would have tried to contact us at the scheduled time, realized this planet couldn't send radio signals, and then return to base. But instead you 3 went on and vanished for a whole month, making all of us think you died. He yelled at the triples, his 2 large black eyes turning shades of red. The 3 humans looked nervous at his grilling, and they didn't know what to say for a long while, until Jack, the tallest brother with the curliest hair, told him, "It's complicated. I don't think you believe us, even if we told you." Jock, the middle child of the triples with the blondest and shortest hair, added, "And wait, did you say month? We were gone for a month, but I thought it was only a week." Jay, the youngest and the one with the most freckles, asked in confusion, as his brothers also had the same expression. "It might have felt like a week to you, but it has been a month. Time on this planet flows differently." Flix told the 3 as Tuxi calmed himself down. Tuxi grumbled something to himself while pulling in his face. After calming down a bit, he fixed his combat gear and vest, while telling the triplets they were to be resigned to civil and janitorial duty unless they actually had something on the lizards and not just goofed off for the last month, something that the 3 men smiled at early on as they took out several map scanner copies, pictures, and various other such things. Spreading them over a folding table, they went one by one and explained what they found out about the lizards. They even triangulated several ways to get around their defenses, ground troops and sends, giving them the optimal route to where their actual base of operation was. Tuxi was generally surprised by this and almost elated that they fulfilled their mission with such ease. Perhaps this mission would go even faster than normal. Humans really did make a difference, even though he wanted to punish them for not coming back right away. He knew they clearly didn't know about the planet and they did just make this potential long-winded stakeout and intel recovery much faster now they could get straight to the fun part where they ran in going bang bang on everything that moved. So he told the three brothers that they were on kitchen and cleanup duty for the remainder of their time on the planet, which they accepted. Tuxie gathered the rest of the militia around the table and laid out their game plan, which would be completed by sunrise tomorrow. They would combine 3 of the humans' mapped routes into one to avoid detection and get as close to the lizard's main base as quickly as possible. Before they finished what they were doing with that, he dismissed them. The group dispersed to return to whatever they were doing before the 3 brothers went off to freshen up after being away from a shower for over a month, and smelled like it too once they had been cleaned up in the ship's onboard shower and returned to the outside camp. They began to work on preparing dinner for everyone, a task easier said than done, while humans could eat anything so long as it was clean, well cooked, and had a bit of flavor. The other 3 species had very specific dietary requirements. Droids needed their food made with as much water as possible. Hence, despite having stomachs like humans, primarily ate meat which had to be raw or alive. The Terrasa Walla mostly ate vegetables, but had to have them sullied in dirt or muck, as it helped their gut bacteria. So by the time they finished everyone else's extremely crazy supper, they were too tired to make anything more complex and just threw whatever was left into a quick stew. As they sat and ate with the group, Jock struck up a conversation with Flix as he was swallowing his meal whole, casually asking him, "So care to explain how a whole dang month has passed in our absence? The same reason that the quasi-lizard men have taken a liking to this planet," Flick replied after his mouth wasn't full of food, but watched as the bulge slithered down his extended neck. "And that would be?" Jocks inquired further. After the food finally made it to his stomach, Flix gave a small burp before replying vaguely, "The core of this planet is filled with a very rare substance known as chrono." The brothers all looked at him, confused, as Flix sighed in exasperation before telling them, "It's a rare rock that affects time itself. It's used on our DOTAP drive, so spaceships and space stations easily move millions of light years in seconds without the use of a wormhole. A small fragment can be used to send a mega-class space station 1.3 billion light years on just it alone. So that's what that weird rock is I see in the engine room," Jake stated aloud in a thinking tone while sipping on his spoon. "Yes, and they are very valuable. The High Council had no idea a planet had a core made up of it," Tuxie added. "Until the lizards?" Jack inquired. "Until the lizards," Tuxie agreed, while slurping the rest of his meal, which was basically waterlogged food of different varieties. Before the sun rose the next day, the small militia had already awoken and geared up. They were already making their way through the thickest grove of trees to avoid being separated from the lizard tech or their natural senses, knowing full well that the planet's pine trees gave off such a pungent aroma that it masked even the smelliest Terrasa Walla, and they had 3 by the time the first rays of light had shone through the horizon. The group had already made it halfway without a single lizard in sight, which was equal parts a good and bad thing. This was good because they didn't need to fight prematurely and alert others, but it was bad because the Terran report said that they were very spread out. So where were they by the time they reached the halfway point? The group had realized far too late that they had ascended a mountain that led to a Cheerfu. Looked all over and around the area, looking for an easy way to get across that didn't involve climbing down several thousand feet down and up again, going around, or trying to get across with jet boosters and grapple lines that wouldn't reach before they failed and fell. Tuxie checked the map and realized that this cliff was on it, but he got his wires crossed somewhere along the way and didn't realize it, so blaming the turn was a no-go. This was on him, and they needed to move fast since the lizards were up to something. So he stamped his foot and yelled, "Damn it, well, we can never get across this cliff, and it's our most direct path to the lizard outpost." "What'll we do?" Flix asked while looking around the open area in desperation. Jack stepped in and approached the front of the cliff, assuring the group, "Don't worry guys, I have some friends who can help." Everyone was confused by his words. What friends did he have on this planet? There was no one else besides them, And the lizards. Then Jack did something even more confusing when he cued his hand to his mouth and made a strange calling sound like a strange bird call mixed. With a yell, he did it 3 times, and within seconds something passed overhead. Everyone thought it was the lizards, but when they looked up it wasn't a hooverpod, but a flock of extremely large winged creatures. They circled above for several minutes before one dive bombed to the cliff and landed right where Jack was standing. Before he stepped away in anticipation, the creature let out a ragged scream similar to the one Jack made. The creatures looked like Haptor, but were far larger, had wings like bats, and were covered in leaf-like feathers. The males and females were very distinct as several more landed around the militia in a semicircle. The females looked very plain and had colors that blended in with the planet's flora. The males had a variety of colors on their faces and necks, usually sunset colors, while their bodies were colored like the females. Jack immediately went up to the first one that landed and began to stroke it under its chin and near its ear hole. The creature grumbled a pleasant sound as it closed its eyes and leaned into the affection. Shift wings, your friends are shift wings, Tuxie exclaimed in shock, jumping on the animal's back. Jack grabbed 2 horns sprouting from its shoulders. He then steered the bird into the air and said, "Yeah, hop on." Within minutes, the rest of the group had mounted a shift wing and moved them to take off into the air. With the aid of the birds, they flew far off into the distance, easily crossing the cliff and having an amazing time being able to reach the lizard's main base. Within minutes, Tuxie was confused by how Jack had managed to pull this off. From what he heard, shift wings were notorious for being flighty and when cornered would bite hard, and since they had a few minutes before they reached the lizards, he decided to ask, "How in the name of the 6th moon did you manage this?" Tuxie asked Jack as he flew beside him on the shift way and yelled over the wind, allowing Jack to recount his tale. Jack had been wandering around the first for quite a while on his first day on this planet, and to be honest, it was pretty hard. The geography shifted so much that it was hard to tell down from up. Every time he climbed a mountain, it was just a hill, and every time he passed a hill, it was a mountain. Not only that, but the trees made it even harder. Luckily, that gave him more than enough space to map out the landscape with his scanner, even if he couldn't find anything on the lizards where they were moving or what they were up to. He at least got a lay of the land. Just as he broke through some foliage, he realized that he was no longer in a flat forest, but near the face of a cliff with many parts that jutted out on all sides, making several platforms and natural stairways from just about every angle. As he walked, climbed, and jumped up and down this platform challenge, he eventually heard a strange noise from around the bend of this cliff ridge moving toward the sound. He eventually came upon what looked like a large flat area where a large boulder was sitting. From behind the boulder, he could hear the sound, which was like an animal screaming. Looking above, he saw half a dozen large bird-like creatures flying overhead, carefully moving around the boulder. He finally found the source of the screaming, which was a large dinosaur-like creature with a colorful head. Its wing was trapped under the boulder, and it couldn't pull itself free. It screamed to its colleagues in the air, but all they could do was circle around and call back. Jack was enamored by the sight of the creature and how beautiful and cool it was. Unfortunately, the animal didn't share the same sentiment. Thinking Jack was a predator looking for an easy meal, it tried to snap at him, but couldn't reach him. Jack stepped back and allowed the animal to exhaust itself before trying anything. "Whoa, easy fella, I ain't going to hurt you," he said to the creature in a soothing, calm voice, keeping his body low in movement. Slow, the animal seemed to regard this and calmed down a bit. Then he heard a noise come from the animal's body and realized it must have been there for quite a while. The creature tried to reach for it, and Jack threw the hunk of meat into its mouth. The animal tossed the meat into the air and swallowed it whole. Seeing that the animal had calmed down enough to approach, he set to work on moving the boulder off his wing. But no matter how hard he pushed, struggled, or strained against the stone, it wouldn't budge. Even the animal tried to help by nudging him with its beak. Eventually he gave up and said, slumping against the rock, "Man, that's heavy." The animal nudged him again and motioned over to a small bush growing off the side of the cliff. Moving to the plant, he saw that it was some kind of berry bush with gray berries. The creature made a noise to him and picking A handful, he asked. What's that? The berries. Are you still hungry? But when Jack tried to offer the berries, the animal refused and shoved them towards him. Jack was confused. Before asking, you want me to eat them? The animal made a noise as if to agree with him, so Jack popped the berries in his mouth and noted how tasty they were. Then he noticed a surge of energy rush through, and for a crazy moment, he thought he could actually move the boulder. And when he did, he pushed the huge stone off its wing with such ease. Watching the rock fall into the valley below, he looked at himself with amazement before saying, wow, I never knew I had it in me. Almost immediately, the animal spread its free wings and tried to fly off, but to the surprise of only itself, due to its wing being injured from being trapped for so long it couldn't fly. And that's what happened. Jack finished off his story before quickly adding, oh, and I put the strength berries into last night's meal. You snuck unidentified food into our meals. Tuxie yelled at him, trying not to feel sick. I put it through the scanners. They said it was safe for you guys. Don't you feel stronger? Jack argued. Back before Tuxie could confirm or deny the claim, Flix came to his side on his own HFY and called out, General, we have lizards on our 6. Tuxie turned his head 180 degrees and saw a small swarm of around 10 lizards riding inside their all-terrain anti-gravity pods, slowly gaining on them. Small metallic orbs with a single glass window that defied the laws of gravity physics and inertia. A single lizard sat inside each pod, obscured by the tint. He turned his head back and yelled over the wind, damn, they found us. Turning to Jack, he forgot his previous anger at potentially poisoning them all and asked Jack, tell me you can get the shift wings to shake them. Oh, I can do better than that. Hold on tight and keep your heads low, Jack called back, while laying low on the HFY and moving its shoulder horns up, causing the animal to dive bomb to the earth. Followed by the rest of the flock, the shift wings dove down before pulling up and flying through a patch of forest. From there, they showed their namesake, where they shifted their wings into a different shape, while the batwing shape was used for catching air and gliding on it. The Teresa wings were used for fast flight and sharp turns, which they used to quickly maneuver in between the trees with ease, allowing them to gain more ground ahead of the lizards. Unfortunately, the Leards couldn't move their pods around the trees as fast as the shift wings to keep up, and within seconds every pod crashed and exploded into a tree as the shift wings broke free from the trees and returned to the open air. The army cheered with glee at their successful escape. The shift wings returned their wings to normal and glided in the air once more. Within minutes, they came upon the lizards' outpost from above. Unfortunately for them, the lizardards caught sight of them long before they could plan any surprise attack. Soon the group was beset by a hail of blaster fire from the ground, causing the shift wings to get antsy. There they are, Jack called. They shooting at us? Jock pointed out. No duh, Jake asked. Evasive landing, Tuxie called to the group as they made the shift wings dive to the ground and land fast behind some well-placed boulders. As the militia jumped off their mounts, they took position around the boulder as the shift wings backed away in fright of the gunfire sounds. Getting weapons ready, each one would take a shot at the lizards, taking down one or two who tried to get too close to their cover. However, this wasn't the best strategy, as they were gaining no ground and the main outpost was still a ways off, seeing no reason to sit and dally on while the lizards eventually overtook them. With numbers, Jack equipped a handheld grenade launcher and announced, "Welp, we've already lost the element of surprise. Let's give him hell, boys." With that, he jumped out from behind the boulder and fired off 3 shots into the group of encroaching lizards, causing 3 huge explosions, an enormous opening to form in their ranks, and bits of lizards to fly off in all directions. Although Tuxie wanted to call Jack back and not disobey his orders, his action gave them the window they needed, so he forged anything he wanted to say and commanded everyone to advance. And advance they did for several hundred yards upon the lizards. Jack would keep this opening going by launching grenades every time the lizards regrouped enough to nearly overtake them. The gun work of Jake, the knife work of Jock, and the hand-to-hand skills of Jack took down any straggling that got too close, but they were the only ones in the action Tuxie would use His minor telepathy to stun any lizard for an opening flicks would use his enhanced strength from the berries to wrap and crush lizards to death, and the 5 Terrasa-wala could use their newly enhanced strength to launch their heads out and bite the lizard heads clean off. However, things didn't go so well for very long. Once they reached the outpost guard wall, Jack ran out of grenades, leaving them with no more openings and many snipers on the guard wall to hit them from a high distance as the lizards nearly swarmed them. The 5 Terrasa-wala turned their backs and allowed everyone to take cover behind them. They took shots using them like living shields. The Terrasa-wala couldn't shoot in this state, but could poke their heads out and give warnings about sneaking lizards. Things weren't looking too good where Pin Flicks cursed as he hissed, with his fangs outside of his mouth in a show of stress. "Let's get back on the shift wings and regroup," Tuxie commanded his team, knowing things weren't going so well, only for Jack to shoot that idea down as he pointed far behind them and explained, "Afraid that's out of the question. The shift wings can't get airborne in this hail of fire. We're going to need something big." Tuxie looked to where he was pointing and saw the shift wings hiding behind a boulder a good distance away. They were unable to get close or jump into the air due to the energy bullets flying all around them. For a moment, Tuxie thought this might be the need for them and almost considered going onto the far armed with a bomb vest to give his team time to escape, but luckily it didn't have to come to that when another miracle happened. "What about that?" Flick said with a fearful chatter in his voice. Tuxie looked up to where he was pointing, and standing on the edge of a nearby mountain were 2 enormous creatures looking down at the battle. Without thinking, Tuxie yelled in fright. The death claws were enormous creatures resembling bears, but far exceeding the size of an African bush elephant. Their coats were white and faded to brown on the upper body and red along the neck, face, and front limbs. They were the apex predator of this planet, and nothing could compete with them. Usually solidarity one was trouble enough, but 2 just made it even worse. Both death claws stomped their feet on the edge of the cliff and let out their bellowing roars several times, getting the attention of the lizards, who all looked up in horror at the creatures. The small militia shared this sentiment, except for Jack, who exclaimed, "Enjoy BRB Wolf." All eyes turned to the man, who was confused by his statement and reaction, leading Tuxie to ask him, "Do you know those death claws?" "Yeah, but they're bigger than when I first saw them." "I guess you were right about time on this planet being all wonky," Jack explained vaguely when he noticed everyone still staring at him. For answers, he said, "Oh, you wanted an explanation? Well, Jack was walking through a slightly wooded area of the planet following a river downstream. He had found that communication on this planet was impossible, and any device used for mapping was also as useful as tits on a boar, so he was extremely lost, and seeing no reason to get even more lost, he tried to use the river to find any signs of the lizards or record anything he could on what they were doing. However, his trailing was cut off when he heard the sound of tiny screams coming from up the river. Putting on his high-tech binoculars, he saw 2 small creatures being swept down the river. He looked down the same river and noticed there was a waterfall at the edge. If he didn't act fast, the little creatures would go right off the edge. So he ran down the stream trying to find anything that could help, until he saw an old tree that had half fallen over and was hanging over the river. He climbed the tree to the branch that hung the lowest over the water, hooked himself by the legs, and hung upside down by them, reaching out his arm. "Gotcha," he exclaimed, as the 2 creatures flowed right into his arms, scooping them up into his body before doing a sit-up and getting back to his feet, where he brought the 2 wiggly creatures back to dry land, dropping the 2 wet fur balls on the ground. He said with relief, "That was a close call. A second longer, and you 2 would have gone over the side." Looking down, he saw that the 2 animals looked very similar to bear cubs, but a bit larger. They were colored to match the forest ground, green and brown, with a splash of red on their faces. They almost reminded him of the bootleg teddy bear he had as a child. Seeing the 2 cubs get up and try to shake themselves dry, he decided to make himself scarce in case Mom was nearby. Unfortunately, when he tried to walk away, the cubs followed after him, making the same baby bear noises that the ones from Earth would Hey, come on now, you two got to go back to your mom," he said while trying to push the cubs away, only for one of them to latch onto his arm in a hug while the other wrestled his leg. Jack tried several more times to lose the bears, but nothing worked. They were surprisingly fast for babies, so running was off the table, jumping over rocks, nope, climbing a tree. They were even faster in a tree than on land. Eventually he ran out of the river and was finally stopped at the waterfall. He saved the cubs from falling off, so he gave up. That's when it finally clicked for him. While sitting down to catch his breath, he was asked, "Oh, you don't know where she is?" The cubs crawled into his lap and began to paw at him with their big soft paws. So he sighed in defeat and said, "Well, I guess I can't let you two go now, can I? But two fighters like you are going to need some names. How about?" He paused for a moment, trying to think of good names, as the wet cubs wrestled one another in his arm before finally deciding on Bjorn and Beowulf. No complaints came from the cubs, and Jack decided on them. Suddenly Jack heard a strange noise from over the falls and stood up with the babies to look over the edge, only to immediately drop to the ground and get under a bush as he sensed the cubs, who were complaining about the rough movement. Taking out his high-tech binoculars, he saw several quasi-lizard men pods floating about and surveying an area with several more on the ground. Using the camera feature, he snapped several pictures and videos while recording his finds and the trajectory of the lizards to what he assumed were their outposts in the distance, too far for his binoculars to see. Even though he got lost, it helped him to find all that he did about the lizards. This would be well worth reporting back at camp. Now he only had to find his way back. Maybe the babies could help him again. Jack surmised the part 2 rest of his tale. "Then I found and returned them to their mom," making everyone stare at him in disbelief, knowing full well that interacting with death-claw babies meant instant death by maying or being swallowed whole, only for their conversation to be cut short when Bjorn and Beowulf raced off the cliff's side and barreled toward the lizards, who began to fire upon them. The blast of fire bounced right off their toughened hide. They swatted away the ground troops like bugs before ramming straight through the gated walls and toppling them over like building blocks. Seeing this, Jock yelled, "Who cares about the details? Your giant bee friends are pushing the lizards back. Let's help them push more." Suddenly, the battle was back in their favor as they easily pushed through the enemy camp, thanks to Bjorn and Beowulf acting as the world's best damaged sponges and battering rams, swiping aside groups of lizards. Any leftovers were taken out almost immediately by the rest of the militia as they pushed through and down any buildings or tents, causing the lizards to flee in mass. Swiping at groups of lizards, the rest of the militia almost immediately removed any leftovers as they pushed through and down any buildings or tents, causing the lizards to flee in mass. Eventually they got to where the lizards had parked their spaceship. Unfortunately, that same spaceship was guarded by 4 large cannons mounted on what looked like metal pillars. The cannons, sensing the arrival of the death claws, slowly turned in their direction and began to pell them with weaponized sound. The result of the cannons was massive. Although it didn't break the animal's skin, the vibrations it caused were so massive that it shook their bones and organs, causing them to cry out in pain as they were knocked off their feet. Each cannon shot one after the other and would reload after the last one fired, only for the cycle to continue. The death claws took cover behind what remained of the building and tents, as did the militia. Even if the cannon only hurt the death claws, they would die if they so much as got grazed. But thankfully they were more focused on the 2 giant animals, and the lizards were taking advantage of this as well, regrouping to swarm the small army before letting the cannon scare off or kill the animals. Impact cannons, even a death claw's tough hide can't deflect something like that, Flix asked as he stretched out his neck to peek at what was holding the living tanks back. "Look, they got that chrono jump," Jack suddenly announced as he pointed to the lizard spaceship with his binoculars. Everyone else looked on their own, and any lizards near the ship were hauling in huge white crystalline rocks on the double tuxie. Pulled off his binoculars and exclaimed in worry, "We can't let them get away with it, otherwise they could pop up anywhere in the galaxy without a wormhole. Then how do we get past those impact Cannon's Flicks asked him as several blaster shots were blasted through their cover, only for everyone to halt in their panic and turn their eyes to the only remaining brother Jack with anticipation for another last-second miracle. Within a few seconds, Jock began to look uncomfortable and made the sounds one makes just before throwing up. He coughed, burped, and gagged before finally spitting something from his mouth into his hands. Everyone expressed the same revulsion as they stepped away from the saliva, stomach, mucus, and whatever else was mixed into the slop before them. Everyone looked ready to vomit but kept their composure long enough. "Holy crap," Jake exclaimed. "I thought you grew out of swallowing weird things when you were 10, Jack said, while turning green. "Oh God, it was terrible," Jock gasped as tears streamed down his face. "You're one to talk. You are not the one having to crawl up your slimy esophagus," said something inside the man's slimy hands. Hearing the voice, everyone crowded around the man as he held what looked like a strange insect in his hands. It was a quarter of the size of a rhinoceros beetle, but colored dirt brown and shaped more like a wasp with large pines on its mouth. After coughing a bit and wiping his eyes, Jock shot back, says the guy who eats as Jock, and the bug traded words with one another, bantering like an old couple. Everyone else stared in a mix of confusion and disbelief. Then Tuxie broke the tension as he inquired, "I'm not the only one who sees this, am I, Jack?" And Jake said at the same time, "The talking bug, my brother, just regurgitated." "Yes, you speak?" Flicks asked incredulously, getting back his composure after spacing out the bug. Turned to all of them and said with a bow, "And therefore, my name is Thorax, and I am a member of the Grax. Sorry about my strange introduction, but I needed somewhere warm, moist, and full of food for me to recover after I nearly got killed." "And that's why he was in your stomach?" Jack inquired. "What was he eating?" Jake asked in an unnerving tone. "My," Jock replied like it was the most normal thing to say, making everyone gag after swallowing the context of his stomach. Tuxie said, "Okay, I don't even want to know what your story is with him." "Good, 'cause it's not too pleasant," Jock assured him. Thorax was insulted by their reactions and argued back with a proud tone, "Don't be like that. My kind has considered feces our prime delicacy for as long as we can remember, and I have to say that terrain feces are a flavorful buffet. Do all of your species' feces taste as good as yours?" he asked Jock while salivating. "I just eat a bunch of sugar and fast food," Jock said with a shrug. Tuxie finally got his mind in order after digesting all this information and his dinner, then went into serious mode as he asked Thorax, "My council, let alone the Intergalactic Congress, never knew intelligent life was on this planet. Why didn't you come out and say something when we came here? Because you kept landing your oversized skyships where we placed our hives," Thorax said in a very displeased tone, buzzing his wings. "So those mounds of dirt in all those open flat areas are actually—" Tuxie began to connect the dots until Thorax confirmed the homes that we personally made and the land that we smoothed out and opened up. "Yes, so we weren't too thrilled about introducing ourselves," he said, crossing two of his limbs in a displeased huff. Tuxie was horrified at this news. He and everyone else who came to this planet always assumed those mounds of dirt were nothing more than that dirt, since the mountains made landing large aircraft hard and trees overtook any flat space. Those open spots were their only hope. But to think that creatures, intelligent creatures, were living there sent waves of guilt and horror throughout him. How many millions, if not billions, had they been inconvenienced by accident or worse, genocided? The very thought was overwhelming. Tuxie got on the ground, bowing low, and begged for forgiveness. "I apologize on behalf of the Congress and a High Council for our ineptitude in not realizing there was a sapient species and that we were damaging your homes." However, Flicks doesn't share the same sentiments. He used his tail and augmented strength to sneakily gain some more debris with his tail to cover them, but it was fading fast, and the shells of the terrace walla were heavily injured anymore, and they would crack. "So," he exclaimed in firm seriousness, "never mind that. How is he supposed to help us?" Jock then took an earpiece intercom from his belt and handed it to the bug. He explained, "Take this intercom and fly to those impact cannons." Thorax nodded and flapped wet wings, drying them fast Before taking off into the air using his small size, he easily flew past the blaster fire, and the eyes of all the lizards, all except for a few who tried to make a quick snack out of him. This was something his people had been facing since the lizards came to their planet, seeing the Gra as nothing more but food and digging up mound after mound to fill their stomachs, which is why he had to take refuge in Jock's stomach when they met. Luckily, he had gotten better at dodging them and made it to the first cannon in record time. With the earpiece, he reached the control panel and found the faceplate containing the connection and power lines for the whole system. Unfortunately, the panel was locked down tight, and no matter where Thorax flew, he couldn't find an opening. Damn it, he cried. What? Flix asked him over the comm. They got this thing locked up tight, Thorax replied, raising the malicious nerves. They wondered if their plan would fail, only for Thorax to see small vent openings and say, "But don't worry, my kind has a special ability." Suddenly, the bug flew toward the plate and shrank to a nearly microscopic size. With the comm in hand, he easily slipped through the air crack and entered the inner workings of the machine until he found the motherboard. "I wish you'd used that when crawling through my digestive tract," Jock said over the comm with irritation in his tone. "Never mind that. Do you see a red wire?" Flix asked him, looking around a bit after returning to normal size. His compound eyes finally fell upon the wire, and he replied, "Yes, cut it." Flix half yelled with increasing worry as their shelter crumbled around the terraza walla. To act as a defense, using his pincers, he snapped through the wire like it was made of grass. The whole motherboard sparked around him before the cannon finally shut down, drawing away the lizard's attention long enough for the terraza walla to catch a break. Once the first cannon was offline, Thorax moved on to the others. "One cannon down," Jock called to his team, only to watch another cannon go offline and recount. Two, then another went down, and he exclaimed in excitement as the lizards began to look worried. 3 down, and 1 remaining. With only 1 remaining, and the fact it took a long time to reload, Bior and Beowulf took this chance to run out of their hiding spot and bolt for the cannon. They jumped upon the cannon, and with their upper body strength, they pushed the huge weapon to the ground, where it crashed and exploded. Seeing their opening once more, Tuxie yelled, "Let's move, people, move, move, move!" The militia pushed in, yelling war cries as they took down the horde of lizards, and were soon joined by the death claws, who resumed swiping and stomping on the lizards, who were defenseless to fight the huge animals as they pushed right to the main spaceship. Any remaining lizards trying to haul more of the crystal dropped their loads and ran for their lives. Another ran onto the ship and tried to close the bay doors to escape. Jocks cried out while trying to take a shot at the lizard, but missed. "Oh no, they won't!" Thorax's voice came over his comm just before the lizard could hit the emergency close button. Thorax, in his small size, flew in before changing to normal size and using his stinger to poke the lizard's eye. Even though their scales were tough enough to resist their stings, their eyes weren't. The lizard fell to the ground, writhing in agony from the pain of the venom, leaving the doors unguarded. "Gotcha, not so tasty now, am I?" Thorax yelled while flying over the lizard's head. From there, the rest of the battle was a cakewalk as Bjor and Beowulf took out any groups of lizards still aiming to attack. In bravery or stupidity, the militia shot down any remaining lizards who tried to attack them, and Thorax, who bravely guarded the cargo ship full of chrono from any other lizard state that tried to escape with it. Only a few of the lizards managed to escape, with the several smaller ships scattered around the outpost, leaving their main ship behind, even as the death claws and shift wings attempted to catch or knock the ship from the air. In retribution, once the last of the lizards fell, the spoilers found out and searched the whole camp for any stragglers or hidden surprise attackers. Luckily, nothing came up, and it seemed that the camp was empty and secured. Just to be sure, they sent out a drone to scan the whole camp and took comic readings just in case. The last task was easier said than done, since they had to keep Bjor and Beowulf still once they were at least 88% sure the camp was clean. Then they relaxed and gave the memo to the other general. Jocks approached Tuxie and saluted him. He then reported, "General Tuxie, the outpost has been secured and the lizards are gone. What are your orders?" Tuxie nodded and saluted him back. Before calling the group back and announcing, "Let's wrap up, any and all Crano take another survey around the planet and make sure those reptiles are long gone, then we'll pack the ship and head back to tell the High Council about everything we've seen and found out." As everyone nodded breathlessly or gave their reply of affirmation, Tuxie quickly added, "But before that, a small celebration is needed for a successful mission. Thanks to you three," he said, while motioning to the three brothers, who looked at him in confusion. While pointing to themselves, he nodded, and marching toward them, he placed a hand on the shoulder of two of the three brothers, while telling them with a proud expression and tone, "I admit I had my doubts about you Terran at first, but seeing how easily you three were able to make friends with so many creatures helped make this mission as successful as it was. Well, I am glad to be wrong for once in my life." Before the brothers could give other thanks to the General, Thorax flew in front of his face and asked in a demanding tone, "I don't suppose I could tag along with you when you leave?" Tuxie stood back a bit so he wasn't looking down his non-existent nose and replied, "Of course, Thorax, but why? I would like to meet with this High Council you told me about and assure them that the Grax exists, maybe even become a representative. We can make more openings and flat land for your ships to land without our homes nearby. And we do have something you want," he said with a knowing sound in his voice, holding up a tiny fragment of chrono. "I don't see why not," Tuxie agreed with a nod, seeing as the GRS now had a means of transport embargo services that the Council couldn't refute, and to be treated as an equal once the excitement had subsided. Flix went to help treat the Terrasa Walla shell injuries with the first aid supplies left by the lizards. Tuxie began writing reports on what happened, and the three brothers took inventory of everything the lizards had gathered or left behind, all while the shift wings flew back home. The Death Claws said goodbye to their first friend, and Thorax hung around them listening and chatting it up with Jocks, who was rambling on and on knowing what their brother was like. Jack and Jake stepped into their conversation and said, "I'm guessing my brother chomped your ears off while you were inside of him." "Boy, that didn't come out right," Jack said, while rubbing the back of his head. "I like conversation," Thorax assured him. "I thought you wanted to join us just to sample the many flavors of alien crap we have." Jock poked fun at him, who says, "I can't have my cake and eat it too," Thorax argued back, as the two of them laughed, leaving Jake and Jack to wonder what the hell kind of friendship they had. After the Battle of Gura had finally ended, the small team of soldiers from all walks of life in the galaxy loaded and transported the rare chrono and gave reports back to the High Council of their findings, with Thorax accompanying them. Deals were made, and Thorax became a representative of Gura and the planet, a part of the Intergalactic Congress. The price of chrono has far reduced thanks to the supplies of Gura, and the small militia was made heroes for their valiant and surprisingly speedy effort in fending off the lizards, taking back an overtaken planet, finding new species to join them, and vastly reducing the monetary strain for intergalactic travel. But General Tuxie always gave cries to the three brothers of Terra Prime and their species' unusual ability to make friends with just about anything under the most strange circumstances.